Engels writes, "It is the compelling force of anarchy and production of society at large that more and more completely turns the great majority into proletarians. And it is the masses of the proletarian who again will finally put an end to the anarchy of production." That is Marxism. Now, you all heard what I just said, and this was common sense Marxism back in the 30s, and this is common sense Marxism in Venezuela, and this is common sense Marxism in China. But if you listen to the people in the United States who currently call themselves left, they are preaching something completely different, something that is so different from what I just espoused there, I don't even need to get into detail about what it is. But we should talk about where it came from, because there's a reason that Marxists don't talk this way. There's a reason that the forces that call themselves left in the United States are putting out a very different message. And we have done a lot of groundbreaking work in CPI for talking about why that is, documenting why that is, and explaining why they put out something different. We want to raise the level of productivity as high as possible. They want to degrow and grind everyone into poverty. We want to empower the proletariat and weaken the power of the bourgeois state. They support the FBI, and they support the tech monopolies and censoring people. They want things that are very different than what we want. Why is this? Well, when we talk about the synthetic left, we're talking about a process. There are two different types of people who become revolutionaries. Anywhere you go in the world, you're going to find what they call a revolutionary intelligentsia. You're going to find middle-class people, usually students, younger folks. Some people do it their whole life, but anywhere you go in the world, socialist countries, capitalist countries, developing world, first world, you're going to find intellectuals who are mad at the world, who are aware of the injustices that exist and are looking to live an important life and, do dramatic things and feel heroic. And that's not inherently bad. That's a good thing to want to change the world. That's a good thing to be outraged about injustice. But that section of society, that revolutionary intelligentsia, is always a small minority. It's never more than 10% of the population. Rarely is it even 5% of the population. It exists, right? We've all seen the Broadway musical Les Miserables. Do you hear the people sing? Those kids in the pubs talking about how they're going to storm the barricades. That always exists. Revolutions are not made by those folks. Revolutions are made by the broad masses of people. And what the broad masses of people want in a revolutionary situation is very different from the fantasies and ideals that that revolutionary intelligentsia wants. What the broad masses of people want is stability. When a revolutionary crisis comes, it's because capitalism and the system has made their life unlivable. And they want order to come out of the chaos. They want to be able to feed their kids. Look at the slogans. What was the slogan of the Russian Revolution? Peace, land, and bread. Not tear it down, burn it down, but it was going to end this war. We're going to feed you. We're going to redistribute the land. You look at the slogans that the Communist Party used back in the 1930s. William Z. Foster, the slogan of his 1932 campaign was the revolutionary way out of the crisis. The message was, you're hungry, you're starving, they're setting up a fascist state, and we offer the way out. And if you look at the Soviet Union, they're industrializing rapidly and raising millions of people out of poverty. We could have a Soviet America and do the same thing. That's what the Communist Party said. And in 1940, when they ran their campaign with Earl Browder for president, they made it shorter. They made it 3 words, the way out. The way out, because they were understanding that, yeah, they had the revolutionary intelligentsia, they had the middle class elements there, but their goal was to organize the broad masses of people who were suffering, and their goal is for stability, not chaos. And that is the understanding. And the brilliance of Bolshevism was that Lenin got a group of revolutionary intellectuals to operate in a way that they could harness the energy of the broad masses of people. He got them out of isolation and into a situation where they could harness the broad energy that was there in order to take power. And you could argue that there were almost 2 layers of the Bolshevik Party. You had the middle-class intellectuals, and then you had the labor unions and then the mass organizations of peasants, of workers. Some people argue that Stalin kind of represented the linchpin between the 2 of them. He was from Georgia, from a rural background. We'll talk more about him later. But he was also educated. He'd been to seminary school. He was a very good writer and speaker, and so he was kind of the linchpin between the broad mass organizations. He was involved in strikes, but he was also able to communicate and compete in the intellectual circles. He was like the linchpin at the center of that. But after the Bolshevik Revolution, we know that Lenin died, and there was a split between Stalin and Trotsky. Trotsky very much wanted to hold on to the revolutionary intelligentsia and their mindset. He put forward the theory of permanent revolution. And the theory of permanent revolution was that the only good the Soviet Union had was that it could eventually march communism into where it actually matters, which is the West. He basically said the West is the best. That's what he said, and that the Soviet Union should just be kind of a military state, a holdout, so we can march communism to where it matters. The New York City, he said, was the foundry where the fate of mankind will be forged, and many people look at Trotsky and say this was very much a self-hating Russian. This is a guy who spent most of his life in exile. He was in awe of London and Paris and the United States, and he didn't much care for the Russian folks. He was probably treated very badly, a victim of anti-Semitic persecution and such. And Trotsky held on to this desire for chaos and death and destruction, the theory of permanent revolution. However, if you read Stalin's writings and his critique of Trotsky, he's saying this isn't going to work. We got to have socialism in one country. You read Stalin's critique of Trotsky on the military question. Trotsky's saying, oh, we're going to draft all the workers into the military and their military service will be working in the factory. That's what Trotsky's saying. And Stalin says, you can't do that. You can't do that. That's not going to work. The population is tired of this military stuff. We need to focus on raising the living standards. And if that means we have to sign a business deal with an American corporation to come and help us set up our car industry or our oil industry, we'll do it because it's about raising the people up. We came to power offering stability and development, and that's what we're going to do. And they did it. And the whole world marveled at what the Soviet Union was achieving during the 5-year economic plans because they were raising people out of poverty. And the Koch brothers, their grandfather, Fred Koch, he was a chemist in the United States who'd invented a new method of turning petroleum into gasoline for your car, and he went to the Soviet Union and he made a lot of money helping set up the Soviet oil industry. And this was a necessary thing to do. And it industrialized the Soviet Union very rapidly and enabled them to win the Second World War, enabled them to invent space travel, enabled them to build some of the largest hydroelectrical power plants, the biggest steel industry in the world. That was going on. Trotskyism was the movement of those who rejected that and held on to the permanent revolution. However, there's another layer to this. 1939, the Soviet Union had gone and tried to form an anti-fascist alliance with every major capitalist country. For a while, France was willing to do it, and then France dropped out of it. The rest of the major capitalist countries wouldn't even consider it. And so as an act of desperation, seeing World War II was on the horizon, 1939, the Soviet Union signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. And immediately, a huge amount of condemnation was piled on the Soviet Union, because how dare they make a treaty with the Nazis? It was done out of desperation. It was not an alliance. It was simply a non-aggression pact. But there was a whole public relations campaign because the communists had been leaders of anti-fascist fronts. They were immediately accused of being hypocrites. Time magazine here in the United States started calling the Communist Party USA the communazis. That was the term they used for them. Earl Browder, the leader of the Communist Party, was thrown in prison. There was a whole public relations campaign against the Soviet Union and against the Communist Party for that. And in that atmosphere, there were some Trotskyites who declared that there was nothing revolutionary about the Soviet Union. That most Trotskyites said the Soviet Union was what they called a deformed workers' state or a degenerated workers' state, that they didn't like Stalin, they didn't like the Soviet government, but the economic foundations were still socialist. But in 1939, there was a clique of Trotskyites in New York City called the New York Intellectuals who cut ties with Trotsky over any defense of the Soviet Union. As far as they were concerned, the Soviet Union was absolutely no good. And Trotsky, before his death, had a big fight with these folks. And James Cannon, the leader of the American Trotskyists, also had a fight with these folks. And in that fight, some revealing things were said by the leaders of American Trotskyism. This is what James Cannon, the leader of American Trotskyism, wrote about the New York Intellectuals. He wrote, Trotskyism became more popular in petty bourgeois, intellectual, and half-intellectual circles. And for a time, it even became a fashion. However, with the approach of the war, Trotskyism as a doctrine and as a movement lost its respectability. And many of the intellectuals, sniffing danger, arranged a somewhat hasty and undignified departure. He also wrote, they mistake their own emotions, their own uncertainties, their fears, and their own egotistical concerns about their personal fate for the sentiments and movements of the great masses. And they measure the world's agony by their own inconsequential aches and pains. He wrote, Marxists always begin with a program. They rally their supporters around the program and educate them in the process of struggling for the program. But petty bourgeois politics is always a hodgepodge, and it never attains a fully developed, consistent program. And in 1939, the New York intellectuals found their way out of Trotskyism. And then something happened called World War II. And after World War II, the New York intellectuals found their way into something called the Central Intelligence Agency. And this is a well-documented fact. Irving Kristol, who was one of these New York intellectuals, became the founder of the CIA's Congress for Cultural Freedom program. And they began with CIA money and money from the Ford Foundation and the Rockefeller think tanks, publishing leftist, socialist, Trotskyist magazines, putting out a new interpretation of what Marxism and socialism was all about. Of course, it was very anti-Soviet, but it went further than that. It went a lot further than that. If you read Susan Sontag, you read Hannah Arendt, you read Mary McCarthy, this writing that they were putting out was much more than just a Trotskyist deviation from what the Soviet Union was putting out. It was anti-populism. If you read what they wrote, the people are the enemy. That is the point that they are making. Fascism in their mind is not capitalism in decay. It's not the result of the capitalist system in crisis. Fascism in their mind is whenever ordinary people are getting together and demanding things and threatening the individualism and the sacredness of the great intellectuals. Hannah Arendt's book, Eichmann in Jerusalem. I read that when I was in college. I thought it was a great book. I thought it was about, we need to be nonconformist, don't go along with the crowd. But if you really read what it's saying, the essence of what it's saying that deep down the broad masses of people are a bunch of bloodthirsty Nazis. It's saying that the Soviet Union is just the same as Nazi Germany and that we need to control the working class because if they get together and start to fight for their rights, it'll lead to some horrendous event. Equating the Soviet Union with Nazi Germany, which is now a big part of American war propaganda, and equating both the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany with popular mass movements and people organizing and trying to advance their economic condition. That is the synthetic left. That is the essence of what they are pushing. And if you read Leo Strauss, the founder of neoconservatism, what he was advocating, you read the work of Irving Howe, who is the intellectual father of Democratic Socialists of America, who was one of these New York intellectuals. That's their message. And it comes out of the split in Trotskyism. It comes out of CIA interventions. And at first, it was a way to manipulate the revolutionary intelligentsia. At first, it was about making sure there was distance between these revolutionary intellectuals and the Soviet Union. It was about expanding the gap between the Soviet Union and the revolutionary intelligentsia. However, in the 1970s and 80s, it started turning into something more sinister. We know who George Soros was. We know who Zbigniew Brzezinski was. And the color revolutions that brought down the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc were largely carried out with this kind of politics. It was about manipulating intellectuals, tapping into the desire of really the most privileged people in these countries. These were the children of the party elite largely, the academics, the people at the universities. The broad masses of people in the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc voted to keep socialism. They supported the communist parties, but it was the university students, it was the filmmakers, and those folks, their grievances, some of which were justified against the Soviet Union, were intentionally manipulated in the name of this kind of fake leftist politics. And it was enabled to create chaos and bring down the socialist countries. And you'll recall, if you read the history, that in the Prague Spring of 1968 and the events of 1989, most of the people that were manipulated into setting the stage for Wall Street to sink its fangs into these countries, they didn't think that they were marching for capitalism. They thought they were marching for socialism with a human face, democratic socialism, more freedom. They thought they were going to keep their guaranteed job, keep their guaranteed health care, but also be able to wear blue jeans and listen to Beatles music and shop at Walmart. It was a con, and it was a manipulation, and it was very effective. And it was a continuation of this manipulation of leftist politics. And now, as we enter a long-term capitalist crisis rooted in the problem of overproduction, this movement that they first developed to manipulate leftism and then utilized against the socialist countries is now being weaponized as the new form of fascism. And it's what is really the ruling ideology of the United States at this very moment. This is what we are living under. Wokeism is a result of this manipulation. They have brought the color revolution machine home to the United States in an effort to try and save capitalism. That's what's happened. And to those of us who've been to the socialist countries, and those of us who know what Marxism is actually about, it is nothing but the most outrageous and infuriating thing. And that is why we are screaming about it from the heavens. You know, I went to West Virginia after Trump got elected, and I interviewed a steel worker. And he had been a lifelong Democrat, but he voted for Trump, he said, because the Democrats don't care about the working class anymore. Now they're just a bunch of socialists. It's a tragic statement. You know, and you listen to people, you know, if I thought Joe Biden was a socialist, if I thought Joe Biden was a communist, I would probably hate communism and socialism too. And this vile anti-working class movement that is about controlling the broad masses of people, grinding them into poverty, setting about chaos in the country so that the ultra-rich can secure their grip on society as we degrow and melt down amid a capitalist crisis. It's very frightening, and many working people want to get together and protect their communities and their families from this insanity. And those of us who understand what Marxism really is should understand we're on their side. We're not with the woke synthetic left.